This week, Josh Marpet from Guarded Risk is with us to discuss governance, compliance, and the digital supply chain. Stay tuned for Below the Surface. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to Below the Surface. It's episode number 27, being recorded on Wednesday, April 10th, 2024. I'm your host, Paul Asadoorian, joined by Mr. Allan Alford. Allan, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Glad to be here as always.
Yes, super excited for today. Before we get started, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclypsium by visiting eclypsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling the Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo, all that at eclypsium.com/go. And today we're talking about governance, compliance, and the digital supply chain with my good friend, Mr. Josh Marpet, the founder of Guarded Risk, executive director, RMISAO co-founder, MJM Growth, EINS faculty member, co-host on Paul's Security Weekly, and so much more. Josh, welcome to the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
It's good to have you here today, my friend. I want to dig into let's just dive right into it and talk about it. And I know you've analyzed this, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show. The regulations slash compliance directives, for lack of a better term, that are directly addressing the digital supply chain. And I think there's quite a few. Maybe we can just kind of run down a high level and then dig in.
You know, and actually, we need to define digital supply chain. I mean, there's the management of physical items. There's what everybody in our world thinks about, which is supply chain security and software supply chain security. And there's physical supply chain security, but it's managed in a digital world. Like there's a lot of different definitions of that. But if you want to talk about this sort of in a generic form, that's totally cool. We have everything from Executive Order 14028, which was promulgated by the White House on May 12th, 2021, May 14th, 2021. Yes, I'm weird. I remember that. I don't know why. There's 853, which has some aspects of that. There's the SBOMs the entire SBOM movement, software bill of materials movement from CISA. They're mandating that now with the cybersecurity manifesto that came out not that long ago from the White House again. SBOMs are required. Zero trust is required. Supply chain security, software supply chain security specifically, is a monstrous thing. Oh, in Europe, they have DORA now for resilience, and that includes some SBOM and supply chain bits. There's supply chain risk management in NIST CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework. That came out in version 1.1, and it's been expanded on in version 2.0. There's I can go on.
Did you Office of Management and Budget Memorandums 2218 2316?
I'm trying not to list everything under the sun, but yes,
I have slides on this, so I was just using them as a guide, which is good information for our audience.
There are the downs. Okay, so the upshot of this is very simple. Like, supply chain security is here to stay. End of story. And if you're not managing your supply chain security for your software, for your hardware, for your firmware, for your physical inventory, for your digital inventory, you got problems, and you're going to go and be sued out of existence in a fairly short amount of time.
Yeah. Allan, you had a question on industry specific stuff.
Yeah, I'm curious, Josh, what's your take on, the specific industries and specific verticals? Who needs to be the most concerned in terms of not just digital supply chain, but in terms of compliance with all these edicts, mandates, laws, regs, recommendations that we just listed?
Oof. I mean, right off the bat, anybody doing business in Europe, they're managing supply chains a lot better than we are here in the US. So if you're a
Okay.
multinational, you'd really best be doing it very strongly. Okay. Plus, they have different standards. So you've got to crosswalk all the standards, and it gets really awkward if you're not careful there. In the US specifically, if you're US centric, I should say, or not doing business internationally, anybody that's doing government contracting, you're required to have SBOMs. You're required to have software supply chain security. So if you're doing federal government or even state government, due to StateRAMP, which is a state version of FedRAMP, the federal cloud security systems, you better be checking over your software supply chain and your firmware supply chain and so on and so forth, especially after the last batch of vulns that have come out. It's unbelievable what's going on in the world of vulnerabilities. The supply chain attacks that we've seen, and everybody knows SolarWinds. Like, if you don't, please climb out from under the rock. Check the news once in a while. It's cool. But the amount of supply chain vulnerabilities that are coming down are ridiculous. And some of this is reflected in government contracting. For example, in CMMC, which is the new federal government, it's not new anymore. Sorry, it's been around for years now, but we've been revising it forever. I helped write some of it. You're required to certify your contractors, which, by the way, if your MSSP or MSP has a remote monitoring and management agent and they have access to the information, the CUI, controlled unclassified information, they have to be certified too. That is a supply chain thing, which goes right back to the SolarWinds supply chain attack. That's exactly what happened there. So government contractors, monstrous effort there.
So wait, Josh, I want to back up and dig into CMMC for a moment. Just
Sure.
for those that don't know, CMMC is the regulations that will govern U.S. federal government contractors.
Yes.
In general, across all walks of the federal government. Is that true?
Yes and no. So right now it's only DoD, but it's expanding incredibly, and it's not even out yet. Like, the final version is out, but it hasn't. It's not been put into contracts yet, so it's not enforced in contracts. But
Yeah, much like a law gets passed in the U.S., there's even once the law gets passed, there's still stages in which it will be enacted and enforced.
Yeah, it enacted, and then you have time to get ready for it, and then it gets enforced. Okay,
right.
But it hasn't even been put into contracts yet. That's supposed to happen like Q1 2025, I believe. And there's already expansion of which departments it's going into. The IRS now has their hand in that. Okay, the IRS has determined that federal tax information, that's your tax returns, are now CUI, controlled unclassified information. If it's CUI, guess what? You're pretty much under CMMC. And guess who has lots and lots and gobs of federal tax information? Colleges. Why? Financial aid. Your kid goes to college, your tax information is in there along with theirs. So colleges are freaking out. Like, do we have to be CMMC certified? The answer is probably. I mean, most colleges already have federal contracts. They do research for the government, and like the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Department of whatever. So they're like, let me put it this way: in the next 2 to 3 years, every branch of the government's going to have CMMC certification requirements, in my opinion.
That's awesome insight, Josh. What does CMMC potentially, because it could change, right? But like right now, what would it require that organizations do in the context of a digital supply chain compliance?
That's a great question. In the context of the digital supply chain compliance, it requires that you understand, and I'm generalizing and simplifying just to be clear, there's a lot of nuance here, but it requires that you understand your boundaries. Where do I get my software from? Where is it used? What information does it process? So that idea of information inventory, data flow diagrams, and scoping boundaries becomes very, very important. Like the scoping boundary of SolarWinds or any RMM, remote monitoring and management, from your MSP, your managed service provider. Well, they have access to our stuff. So therefore, guess what? They're now in scope. All right, we've just pulled them into scope. So there's a lot of MSPs that are going, okay, we need to do our job, but we need to do it without an RMM if we're going to service those communities. Or if we're going to have an RMM, which makes life so much easier to do patching and monitoring and logging in and saying, oh, no, you just have something on your space bar, because it happens, or whatever, then we need to build out a tech stack and a methodology and a process that we can defend to an auditor, because otherwise we're going to fail. So it's such an important aspect of understanding your boundaries. There's a piece of information. Okay, cool. What touches it? How does it get processed? How does it get used? Who has access to it? How is it stored? How is it classified? How is it tagged? And it all goes back to the data. Let's be clear. It all goes back to the data. But the
And
software,
but that includes computer systems that it is stored on,
yeah, of course,
processed through,
which have
right? So, like,
firmware, which have
your PC's firmware and software is included in scope, but the data
absolutely.
I live on a
Yeah.
PC, and so you need to understand the components and the firmware, on that
The data
device.
lifecycle includes everything it touches: the
Mhm.
server, the network link, the router, the disposal mechanism if you're doing retention period stuff. The data lifecycle management is all of those things and everything associated with them, which means that it's the hardware, the firmware, the software of the system that it's processed on, the system that it was generated on, the system that it's stored on, the system that disposes of it. All of that is in scope effectively.
Right, because it's in the supply chain, and
Yep.
we've seen threat actors go after this supply chain, embed themselves in various things inside the supply chain, inside components, hardware, software, firmware, in the past to gain access to intellectual property, right, from the U.S. government, secrets, basically.
15 or so years ago, Travis Goodspeed showed me how he could put Linux on a hard drive,
Yep.
not on the platters, on the
Hmm.
PCB of the hard drive. And it ran the hard drive in such a way that it would siphon data and send it somewhere. And it never was a write on the hard drive, it was living in the PCB. That was 15 years ago. If we
Yeah,
have,
some of our research folks presented on that several years ago at some conference somewhere. And I often refer back to that YouTube video because they talk about, Jesse and Mickey talk about putting malicious code on the various components that are inside of your PC server laptop.
which means that if you haven't seen an attack on that specific component in your server, laptop, desktop, router, whatever, either you don't know it exists and it does, or it just hasn't been attacked yet, but it will be
Mhm.
attacked. Yeah, probably tomorrow.
And so CMMC is saying that you have to be aware of this. You have to include it in
Yes,
like your asset inventory and understand the supply chain and make sure it's up to date. I don't know, but does it get into like updating your software
it
kind of thing?
doesn't get into the update of the supply chain documentation as much. It's
Hmm.
there in spirit. You should be doing these things on a regular basis, but remember that they only certify every year, every 3 years, a certain set of controls every year. Similar to FedRAMP,
And,
you have
and so does CMMC say you got to do what NIST CSF 2.0 says to do in terms of supply chain risk management, which is largely what 2.0 introduced?
Yeah, basically. So CSF from NIST is a risk management standard. It is not a security control standard. Let's be clear. It has quite a few security controls in it, but it's a risk management and risk monitoring and risk measurement standard. Okay, so NIST CSF is an aspirational standard. You measure yourself. Okay, we want to be here. We're here. We need to move up here. Let's figure out how. Okay, that's literally what it is. You build a profile of where you want to be, then you measure where you are now, you find the gaps in between, and you go, okay, how do we close that gap? That is a risk monitoring and management standard. Now, it has some security controls in it. It is not a security control standard. But the ideas and concepts in that are in NIST 800-171, NIST 853. 800-171 is the grandparent, if you will, of
Hmm.
CMMC. It's based on 800-171, which is a subset of 53.
Alan, you had a question about teeth, though. I think
Yeah, yeah,
it's a good
yeah,
time
and
to
and
talk about that,
I
right?
I think Josh may have already answered this one, but, CMMC is the FARS clauses 171 and 172 if you go through the 3 tiers effectively, right?
Right.
And as you just said, 171 and 172 are much more prescriptive in terms of actual security controls. Um, but as we fall back and look at the regulation, and I think you just demonstrated and described CMMC as having some real teeth here, but are there any other ones that either have teeth or are going to? What else is on the horizon? Because I want to see more than just CUI, CDI, and government contracting address. Like CMMC, great. They're targeting an audience that we really need to target. But what else is coming for the rest of us? Where are the teeth, man?
So I want to point you at GDPR. And there's a
Yeah,
reason for this. Bear with me for a second. GDPR is an EU standard, a European Union standard, right? Yes. Does it only affect people and organizations in the EU? No.
no, it affects any
According to them,
citizen of the EU.
if you have any data about a citizen of the EU, you're under GDPR.
Mhm.
Okay, but that's only that one standard from Europe, big flippin' deal. No. CCPA, which is California, says that if you have data about a single Californian citizen, you're under CCPA. So that kind of jurisdictional reach, which GDPR really initiated, in my opinion, is now being copied in the US significantly. And CPRA, which is replacing CCPAs in California, is actually more onerous. Okay, these standards have significant teeth. GDPR, for example, has the penalties are 20 or 40 million euros, and or 2 or 4% of your global annual turnover, whichever is greater. Yay!
Mhm.
So now they can do less. Don't get me wrong, and they can do a lot more, and they have. And DORA is similar in its extra jurisdictional reach and in its idea that penalties should be severe enough to make you go ouch. And that's basically the idea.
DORA? What is DORA?
DORA is the European Union standard for institutional resilience. I'm probably mangling that, but basically,
okay.
how well can you handle issues? And so they're really coming up with these broad standards. GDPR is about customer data and data privacy and your right to own your own data, right? DORA is about, as a company, are you resilient to issues and problems? Are you going to protect that data well enough that we consider you acceptable to do business in the EU or to hold data about EU citizens anywhere in the world? And that kind of, for now, at this point, it's, yeah, of course we're going to do it that way. The EU citizen anywhere in the world. That's the way we do it. Yeah, but what if I don't do business in the EU? You sell to people in the EU. Yeah, but they live in Texas. That doesn't matter. They're EU citizens. Even if they live in Texas, you're selling to an EU citizen, you're under our rule. Nebraska, I think it is, I could be wrong, has a similar rule coming out now. A lot of states are coming out with rules. The US states are coming out with rules that are very similar. Sorry, you have data on our citizens, you're under our rules.
Yep.
And so now you've got to the point where, and the SEC with the 4-day disclosure window, you're getting to the point where these rules are constricting narrower and narrower and narrower until they're choking our ability to do business to a certain extent. But I respect a lot of the intent of these rules. I think some of the operationalization of it is iffy, but it's a pendulum. It's going to swing back the other way eventually.
Alan, you had more questions about the EU regulations as well.
Yeah, I mean, EU's got CRA, right? What's CRA about?
Sorry, when you say CRA, I think Cyber Risk Alliance. So forgive me. Which one is CRA?
This is, geez, I don't know what CRA stands for either. I read about this one.
Yeah.
It's
this is one that I got a glance on.
Yeah, it's the
Cyber Resilience Act.
Cyber Resilience
There we go.
Act. Yeah.
There we go.
Sorry, I keep thinking every time I hear CRA because
I know it's an overloaded term.
Yeah.
Well, let's be honest. Acronym collision is common in our world. We speak in
Sure.
acronyms, for God's sakes. I worked at the Federal Reserve Bank. Do you know they had a server migration and transport project? And I'm like, oh, mail servers? Like, no, what does that have to do with mail? I'm like, SMTP?
Yeah.
And it was bad. But the Cyber Resilience Act is hardware, software, anything that's sold, I think, in only the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I haven't read that one in a while, so I apologize. But it's, you've got to take security through the life cycle of the product, and you've got to take it seriously. So this includes the software that's on the product, the firmware that's on the product, the supply chain of the product. For example, and when I say supply chain of the product, if your product sends data out, it includes the stuff and places and systems that it sends data out to.
Yep.
Or if it receives data in, same idea. Okay.
Almost the data controller, data processor model, right? Like that same.
Well, I mean, that's where they live.
Yeah.
You know, they're living. So in the EU, and I don't actually disagree with this. The idea is you as a company have a responsibility. If you're a producer, if you manufacture software or hardware with software on it, firmware, whatever, you have a responsibility to maintain that software, firmware, hardware, whatever, throughout the life cycle or expected life cycle of the product.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a perverse incentivization there, by the way. It incentivizes you to make the life cycle as short as possible, but that's a whole different story. But the throughout the life cycle of the product, and if you're a receiver of the product, if you're a seller of the product, if you use the product, whatever, you also have responsibilities. Okay, you can't just throw the product in a cabinet, open it up 5 years later, realize it's vulnerable because you didn't let it get patched for 5 years,
right?
And then start suing people left and right. That's sorry, no, you've got a responsibility to actually update things,
right?
All right, but so there's response. So what they're doing is they're building a shared responsibility model and trying to very clearly lay out who has responsibility for what. As manufacturers, we're not used to that. The only responsibility we have is to paying customers who are paying the 20% per year for support, right? Nope. You're responsible for anybody that uses your
Yeah.
product.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean for open source? Well, the open source licenses actually explicitly call that out, as in we will do best faith support, good effort, what is it? Good faith, best effort
Yeah.
support type of stuff. But there's no guarantee because you never paid for it. And since there is no reciprocal remuneration, you didn't pay for it, you can't request and require that kind of support. When you
Right.
pay for something, though, you're now on the hook for supporting that for the expected life cycle of the product.
Yeah, but as the person who, or as the entity who integrates the open source into your product, you're still beholden and responsible. And we get into this week's fun one where some code got inserted into an open source project. Um, Naughty, naughty, So yeah, it gets interesting quick. And I, it's the GDPR model is what I'm hearing, but applied specifically to security, not privacy. That's basically what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Data controller, data
Yeah.
processor
The
affects
CRA and
anyone who's
DORA
an
X.
EU citizen. That sounds like teeth.
Oh, well, and here's the thing. The teeth is the same as GDPR.
Yeah.
Millions of euros, percentages of your global annual turnover. And again, if you're open source, if you're a pure open source developer or this project, an open source project, you don't have revenue except for maybe donations, and that doesn't count as revenue from your product.
Mhm.
So you're not liable for very much, if at all. Okay, maybe a slap on the wrist. But if you take that
In
open
in
source,
practice, though
go ahead.
in practice, though, open source projects tend to, at least in my what I've observed in the past 19 years, have all been pretty good, even better, I think, than the commercial sector in applying patches. I mean, we just saw that with the XZ vulnerability
XZ,
rather,
yeah.
libzma, right? And the project was very quick to remediate those vulnerabilities, and we've seen it time and time again. And so Josh Corman brings up this notion, and I forget what he calls it. It's something along the lines of like the last line supplier, right? And it goes back to a case of Buick with wooden wheels, and they wanted to sue Buick, and they were like, no, it's the Firestone who provided the wooden tires. And the U.S. ruling in like 1911 or something like that
Oh,
was,
wow.
no, you provided the final goods supplier, something like that.
Assembly,
Final
final,
goods assembler.
yeah,
Final
yeah,
goods assembler might be the
something
term,
like that. Yeah.
right? You provided the final goods assembly. Therefore, all of the liability falls on you. You had upstream components. So now translate that to I'm selling a VPN appliance to a company in the EU. I'm responsible. I mean, this is according to US law, right? Conceivably, I believe they should be responsible for the assembled goods. That means if there's a heinous vulnerability in open source, you can't go sue the open source project, but likely they've fixed it anyway, right? Also, this is a great, I think, a good situation to be in because I can go fix the code myself because it's
Yeah.
open source,
Yeah.
right? Commercial components, we almost have more of a challenge, right, in doing that. Open source, I think, in this particular case, I mean, open source has its security challenges, as we've seen this week, certainly. But in this case, I think it's a great thing. It's why I really like things like open source drivers
Yeah.
and things like that because the code is there and someone can go in and fix it.
Well,
It's not just
I
about
want
the
to,
fixability, it's about the eyes on the prize, right? Like,
Hmm.
when SolarWinds got their code compromised, maybe 3 developers actually knew where to look and what to look for if they happened to. But if someone does that to OpenSSH, you've got potentially hundreds of thousands of developers looking at that code.
so I'm going to agree and disagree with both of you. I think I'll think. Let me figure this out. Spanish Inquisition moment. But the concept of Allan, hundreds of thousands of developers. What we found is that open source projects have the ability to have hundreds of thousands of developers looking at them, but realistically, they don't tend to actually have that many looking. Everybody assumes somebody else is doing it. So
Mm.
open source projects are perpetually strapped for personnel to actually make changes, fix things, patch things. But what I do want to point out is the different mindset and incentivizations. What does an open source project take pride in? They take pride in their
Yeah.
functionality and their stability. What does a closed source product take pride in? Their revenue. So what gets you more revenue? New features, new benefits, new stuff, shiny bells and whistles. So did you get more revenue by going back and patching your old stuff or helping the open source project fix their stuff so you can integrate it? No. So that's a cost, not a benefit. And I think those different mindsets are actually, and it's a psychological thing, I guess, but it's actually important, are a
No, it's an
huge
incentive
component.
thing. 'Cause I've said this about the Linux kernel. Like, Greg runs the Linux kernel security program, and he's like, "Look, you can use the Linux kernel, you can not use the Linux kernel. It's free, it's open source, like, that's not the point," right? He's like, "We're gonna do our best to fix the security bugs. Sometimes there may not be a security bug, it might just be a bug, and we're gonna do our best to make that determination and fix things and add features as we see fit, but if you don't like it, use another kernel."
Yeah. It's not going to hurt his feelings. Okay. What is going to hurt his feelings is when you shake your finger at him, but no, I'm just kidding. Like it's an incentivization mindset, and it's a psychological, and where do we get our pride from? And that's a fascinating topic when you talk about software, but that's a whole different story. I apologize. But then you go into the firmware and the microcode and all those things, and then you've got people that are building things, some of which, by the way, is heavily dependent on open source libraries that haven't been maintained in God knows how long for some of them. Insert relevant XKCD here, where there's that little tiny thing that everything is reliant on, right?
Right.
Yeah, I
And
happen to pull up the covers on a device that is used in the enterprise to
which one?
communicate.
NCC 1701D E. Sorry, I couldn't
Let me see.
resist.
And you're
Nerd.
right. It's a device used for communications in the enterprise. It
Uh-huh.
has firmware, and I lifted up the covers. And one thing I discovered is that it's Linux kernel 2.6.
I'm sorry, what?
Yes, Linux kernel 2.6. And this is the latest version of firmware for this particular device. And it is Linux kernel 2.6.
You're joking.
Yes. So this is what I think. I don't know if the EU CRA, which kind of led us down this path, I think it's what it's hoping to address, right? Is this concept of vendors need to be responsible and fix like known exploitable vulnerabilities. Now, maybe there's not a whole lot of known exploitable vulnerabilities in Linux kernel 2.6 that are reachable from this device. However, I think I want to see the tides turn where manufacturers and vendors have to update their software, right? They need, I believe,
Yeah.
some type of regulation to say, no, you can't ship a product with this software that's this old that has this many vulnerabilities that certain number of them could be reachable, because we have to talk about reachable as well.
And so then you bring up the fact that if a vulnerability isn't a vulnerability unless it's actually exploitable, right? If I have a vulnerability that is literally absolutely not reachable by an end user, by an attacker, by anybody, it's buried so deeply in something or other. I'm not going to get into it, but you get the idea. Is that an exploitable vulnerability? Do I have to deal with it? And the answer is not really, depending. But
These are
then
nuanced things, right?
these are
Because you could find
nuanced
another
things,
vulnerability that makes that other vulnerability reachable now.
exploitable, and
I
that
think
could be 3 years
we
down
saw
the
that
road.
with Avanti did some patching, and then one of their vulnerabilities was reachable through some other vulnerability,
Oh,
and they had to fix that vulnerability. And
Yeah.
look, they've been good about fixing their software, right? Like, we all live in glass houses, right? We've all either written for software or worked for companies that make software. We all live in glass houses. No software is perfect, and they are fixing it, right? But it is an interesting thing. Like, how do you regulate the? Well, you don't necessarily have to fix that vulnerability because it's not reachable, but now it is reachable. Like, there's software has these nuances that I think make it very difficult to regulate.
yep.
But I think a lot of us are on the same page. We all want this common goal of, we don't want something that is going to, as soon as I implement it in my environment, introduce more attack surface and more risk to my organization.
There's an
And the
analog
problem,
here.
go ahead.
I was going to say the new SEC regs, where you have to file and say any major breach or any number of minor ones that might add up to a major, right? Like
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
SEC is
Might
calling that out, and
might
it's the
add
same
up
thing
to a
with that
major.
software kill
Yeah.
chain. 3 minors that can reach one another can become a major very quickly.
And how many? And this goes back to something I talk about on a regular basis. I keep getting asked, "Hey, when should I remediate vulnerabilities?" I'm like, "Well, what do you mean? How fast should I remediate criticals and highs and mediums and lows and information? Like, how fast should I do that?" And I'm like, "As fast as you can determine what the risk is." And they go, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Well, look, if I can get rid of a critical that allows you immediate access to everything in my system, that's good that I got rid of it, right?" Like, yeah. Like, okay, what about these 3 mediums over here that allow the exact same access, but because they're mediums, they're not as highly rated? Well, but they're mediums. I didn't say that. What I said was they're mediums that allow you the exact same access as that single critical. Are they just as important and should be remediated as fast as the critical? Well, yeah, I guess so. Okay, great. So now you've done a risk analysis of these things. But unless you can understand how mediums can get chained together, to create an actual critical. Like it's additive, to be honest with you. Okay, and sometimes multiplicative. I think that's the right word.
Mm.
Sometimes it's arithmetic, and sometimes it's logarithmic. Then you better eliminate those as fast as at least one of them, so the chain doesn't work anymore. Like you were saying, the cyber kill chain. But excuse me. And so you've got a massive amount of risk management and risk measurement that we need to mature very, very quickly in our world. And that's monstrous because risk quantification is something that right now is black magic. We don't know how to do it right.
Yeah,
And
I
somebody's
agree.
going
I
to say
think
fair.
this is part of the subject of my talk that I'm giving in a couple of weeks at Besides Charm, right? And coming up with prescriptive advice for organizations. How do they navigate these waters? There's a lot of factors to take into consideration, and those factors change, right? I think that's what's different from a lot of
Yep.
other risk evaluations in other walks of life is these factors change so rapidly. How do I know what I should be fixing? How should I prioritize? Because it does change.
Yep.
I think one thing that we can't lose sight of, and we tend to focus on, and this is my opinion, but we focus on, oh, there's an exploit for that vulnerability, so I have to fix it. Well, not it depends on your environment. I think it's more about how could this impact my environment? Where does it live in my environment? And that should carry the most weight in my remediation. Maybe it's some mediums and lows, but it's in a super critical. Again, I'll use VPN appliance as a exposed to the internet. It contains sensitive information in that it's tied to my Active Directory. Therefore, those should be prioritized. Forget if there's an exploit. What's going to be the most impactful to your organization?
Yeah, I could. And again, we go back to risk quantification and risk measurement and on an ongoing basis because, look, doing a pen test once a year is perfect, right? That never has a problem. And point in time, as we've all learned over the past few years, but still haven't come up with a good solution for, is crap. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. Getting an idea of how bad you are is what a pen test is about. Saying that I'm secure for the rest of the year because I did a pen test 6 months ago is absolute crap. All right. Because 5 minutes after the pen testers leave, and let's assume they're world class. They've found every single flaw, vuln, crack, hole, crevice. They've explored everything. And I mean, they're all up in your wiggly bits. Okay. And they find everything. And you fix everything because you're amazing at remediation. All right. Paul, we know how good you code. All right. You're amazing at remediation.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And then 5 minutes later, some developer commits code.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Reset the clock.
Reset the clock. Okay, so now the same exact issue is here around the risk of your software, your firmware, your libraries, your open source, your closed source, your everything. You're going to tell me you know how your risk is quantified? You're going to tell me how much risk you're in? I very much doubt that.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, let's add some AI in there. Not that your users are pressuring you to use Copilot. Not at all. Because I'm positive. I'm absolutely positive that all of your data is tagged and classified correctly, that everything is in the proper place. You've got a full information inventory, that you don't have any of those documents that Allan saved over there in the wrong place in the wrong data repository, and
Never done
the
that.
permissions are screwed up. And he lateraled 3 years ago, but that document's 5 years old, so he still has access to it. Everybody's using it as their shared document for all the finance stuff and P&L and whatever else. And he still has access to it, even though he's not even in the department anymore. Oh yeah, those documents exist.
There's two sides to this kind of last part of our conversation that I want to dig into. And the first one is, I think what we're talking about now is where should people start when designing and building supply chain security programs, right? We've kind of touched on the priority part, but CSF 2.0 and a lot of other regulations are saying, well, you need to have some kind of supply chain risk management, some kind of program. And I know you advise a lot of people on this, Josh. What's your advice?
Do an inventory. Start with what I have. You can't protect anything you don't know you have. So do you have a list of all of the software that you run? Do you have a list of all the applications, the operating systems, the different versions of firmware, everything from a BIOS on up is your fault and your problem. So let's get a list of it all. And let's figure out what data touches what. Do you have data flow diagrams? You should. And if you have data flow diagrams, you know that this data, which is our mission critical data, goes over here and in this system is processed. That system, here's my list of all the stuff in that system from firmware on up, like I said. And then it goes across this network link. Here's the router. Here's the router on the other end, and switches or whatever else in between. And it goes to our data sharing partner and crosses the demarcation line. It's their problem now, but whatever. But the point is, within my boundaries, within my demarcation lines, I should know where everything gets touched, how it gets touched, what software that thing is running, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you have that, then you can start determining, hey, okay, and we did our data inventory, so we know we do not have any EU citizens' data. Cool, makes our life easier. We are a public company, so we're under the SEC disclosure rule, but we have an idea of all the different things that we're doing and all the different softwares and firmwares and libraries and SBOMs that we need to collect and use. The standards, like, don't even bother with the standard up until then. If you have an inventory of everything that you're mission critical and you're restricted and you're confidential and whatever data touches as it goes through its data lifespan and data life cycle, you're a really good portion of the way there. And we haven't even touched a standard. We
Yeah,
just
and it's interesting. The question that many asked this week is, do I have XZ, and is it vulnerable? If
where's
you
your
can't
asset
answer
inventory?
that, you gotta go back to what Josh is saying, right? If you can't answer that
Yeah.
question, you gotta go back and you gotta build that stuff.
How many years have we had threat intelligence feeds?
Oh, if you called the now I don't even know how to say it politically correct today. Back in the day, we had the whitelist and blacklist SMTP servers. That was like your
Yep.
kind of first dipping your toe into, which was, a lightweight, I would call it, threat intelligence. Right?
Absolutely agreed.
These mail servers are bad. These mail servers are good. In some way, I believe that is the threat intelligence.
Yeah, allow list, deny
We were
list, by
doing
the way.
that. We were doing that like in the allow list, block list, right? But we were doing that. I want to say in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
When we
Oh,
had,
easy.
I can't even remember what it's called. It was even right in that time frame.
The
I
RBLs, the
forget
regional
the
blacklists, and
RBLs. Yeah.
yeah. And we had that. So we've had threat intelligence for this long, and very few people have realized that if you don't have an inventory, it's worthless.
Right.
If you don't have an inventory and you get 10,000 threats in, because threat intelligence is a fire hose, okay? You get 10,000 threats in an hour, a day, a week, or whatever. And if you don't have an inventory of what you have to correlate threat intelligence versus my assets and say, none of this matters to me. Oh my God, that one, I have, like, everything I have is that. Oh crap, that's bing, 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 bing. Okay, if you don't have an inventory, threat intelligence is worthless. Yes, we have threat intelligence. How often do you use it? We don't know how. Oh, gee, you've checked a box. Yay. Okay, so that's
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, Josh. I think in even mature organizations, especially those that are large and are doing mergers and acquisitions, maintaining that list of what they have is really super difficult.
Daunting.
And so when a threat comes across, they're like, "Do we have this?" Well, now I got to send an email out to a list, and people have to go check and look. Like, do I have that? I don't know. We just acquired this company. Oh, they do have this Fortinet, this Avant, the Cisco, the whatever the latest threat is. Oh, we have that. But it's a manual investigation, which is, it's resource intensive.
And that
You know how many companies
investigation
I've
can
talked
go
to?
external too, right? Like, I'm
Oh, yeah.
thinking of Heartbleed. I had to email every vendor whose stuff I had to go, are y'all using this? Because I don't know, because I don't have an SBOM of the interior guts of your switch, router, VPN,
Right.
whatever it might be. Like, do you have Heartbleed? And the vendors would slowly come back with, yeah, or we don't think so. That was my favorite. We don't think we have Heartbleed.
We don't think so.
So along those lines, I want to give credit to Palo Alto, who released a statement, a whole post that was like, look, we looked at all our stuff, the XZ backdoor, we didn't find it.
Good.
And I was like, that's great. Like, yeah, like 2 thumbs up for you guys. I applaud that. I'm like,
That's
that's great.
huge.
Like, you didn't have to do that, right?
No.
If you had it, you might want to disclose it. But they're like, well, we don't have it, but we're going to disclose it. Put everyone at ease. Back to your,
Good.
CISO, from a CISO perspective, seeing that, I'd be like, oh, that's great. Now I don't even have to ask, right? They just told me, like, they looked. Then you have to trust that they looked very thoroughly. But given the limited scope of this issue, that kind of aside, but they did. So good for them.
And the thing is that every manufacturer of products should be able to do that in no time flat.
Yes.
It should be literally automated. If you, as a manufacturer of a firewall product, a manufacturer of a software task organizer, who the hell knows, whatever, if you don't know what libraries you're using, then you have a problem right off the bat. But if you know what libraries you're using and you get a threat feed, because they should get a threat feed as well, they should be able to go through a threat feed and go, not a problem, not a problem, not a problem, not, ooh,
Mhm.
that might be a problem. Check it out and be able to go and be able to feed that threat feed, at least the headers of it, to all of their clients and go, none of it. This one, we checked. We have that library, but we have an updated version. We're fine. So not a problem. And just go all the way down. It should be an ongoing, continuous thing. Oh, wait, you can
Yeah,
do that
and
with
that
SBOMs.
but the technology and processes exist for that, for software
Of course.
creators in a
Of
big way.
course.
I mean, it even goes down to the level of, well, yeah, I have that library, but either I've modified it or like inside my code, I never call that function. And yes, we're going to fix it, but there's no immediate risk. And you should fix it because all it
Yeah.
takes is a developer to add a few lines of code and go, oh, now I'm calling that vulnerable function and we're vulnerable, right? Don't leave it there. But
So then you
uh,
could send a note going, hey, we don't call it natively. If you have developers that are customizing it, don't
yeah,
call this function. In 2 versions from now, it's on our roadmap already to remove the ability to call the function. But until then, tell your developers, do not call this function.
That's it.
Ta-da!
That's it.
You've been a thoughtful, appropriate, somebody that I would that engenders trust from me.
hmm
That I like that. I'm using them. They're awesome.
yeah, I
Okay.
think
This is a
we're addressing Alan's
benefit.
question. We're addressing Alan's question of what do vendors do, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Well,
this is what they should do.
we've talked about regulations with teeth. We've talked about the Josh method. The $1,000,000 question is, where's the framework that embodies the Josh method? Like this is both a question and almost a challenge to everybody who's listening to this. Like the Josh method seems pretty sane to me. Where's our framework that captures that and helps people do this and becomes the CSF type standard that we can all point to and say, here you go. Are you going to
Anybody
write
ever
that,
heard of
Josh?
the CIS Top 18?
Yes.
What's the number one?
Asset
Anybody?
inventory,
Asset
just like
inventory.
just like it is in CSF.
Hey, what do you know? These are common, normal things. Like we've been saying, get an asset inventory and get a software inventory. And at this point, it's get a firmware inventory, get a
Mhm.
library inventory of all the software, reach out to your vendors and get inventories from them. Oh my God, I'm not claiming like the Josh method of, dear God, I'm not claiming to be a genius. I just like doing the fundamental stuff that we're supposed to have done for the last 20 bloody years.
Yeah.
We're supposed to have an
And
inventory.
there's lots of great. I mean, there's lots of great tools. I mean, obviously, our platform, self-serving, is one, right? But there's ways to get this information, and I think organizations, in my assessment, largely just struggle with the procedural, operational aspect of creating and maintaining an in-depth asset inventory. Largely because things are changing, and there's lots of competing priorities as well, and resource constraints. But those are some of the challenges I think we face.
Why is it on security to have an asset inventory and a software and library and firmware inventory?
Mm.
Why isn't it built into everything that infrastructure does? Why isn't it built into like why doesn't CMDB collate all of this information like that? Why isn't it why isn't it in the CI/CD pipeline to just create an SBOM, drop it into the CMDB, and go, there's all of our stuff. Leave it alone.
Yeah.
Okay. Why isn't it just built in? This is like certificate automation. When you have a certificate, it should be automatic. If you're manually doing certificate renewals for your test lab, okay, I get it. That's fine. But in production, dear God, why are you manually doing certificate renewals? For God's sakes, at least turn on Let's Encrypt. It's free, for God's sakes. Okay. And if you don't want, and if you need something a little more enterprise grade, there's so many automation companies that'll just pop, 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 done. Why are we doing it manually? And yes, by the way, there are companies still doing it manually. I know
Mhm.
many banks still doing it manually. If you would believe that they're all the certificates they run, they're doing it manually for certificate regeneration and renewal. I go, what? No, automate. It makes life so much easier and
Yep.
it's reliable. It should be the exact same thing for asset and software and firmware inventories. Just that
There's a
simple.
maturity curve. Yeah, there's a maturity curve to running your asset inventory, right? And by the time you get higher up on that maturity curve, your other tools should be feeding your CMDB in an automated fashion.
Oh my God.
You've got sensors and detectors that you're already paying to sense and detect. Why not
Mm.
also tell them, hey, drop the latest details into the CMDB, cross reference to what we know today, and throw an alert when you have 10 new IP addresses or 10 new whatever's pop up that don't seem like they're already addressed and accounted for?
But Alan, there's small companies out there. You horrible, nasty person, you. There's small companies out there that can't afford all these tools. What's wrong with you, man? And I'll tell you,
So
my answer to that is that they normally don't build their own. They don't combine tools. So they
right.
use Google and M365 and Salesforce. And those are big companies that should be able to just hand them the inventory and look out for them on their own anyway. Salesforce
Mhm.
should go, hey, we're updating you. Don't even think, don't worry about it. We got this covered. Okay. Same with Microsoft, same with Google, same with whomever, Meraki, whomever they use, okay, for this stuff. Turn on automatic updates. We've run automatic updates on Windows for how long now? Hell,
Right.
I've run it on my Linux boxes for how long now? Okay. I know. Paul hand compiles all the code using
No,
just a
I
0 and
definitely
1
don't.
keyboard.
I
Doesn't even
definitely
use
don't.
English, just 0 and 1, 0 and 1 in assembly language. But the rest of us turn on the auto update on our Linux boxes,
Sure we do.
right? Yeah. So why aren't we doing, for small companies, that's all they should be have to do. Turn on auto update, be done. For larger companies that are building software, for larger companies that are combining software, for larger companies that have all these complex workflows and data flows and everything else, they're the ones that need to do this, and they should be at the maturity level to do this. That's my thought.
Yeah, I think again when I chatted with Josh Corman, he was talking about the reluctance of folks, vendors, to provide SBOMs, and that's
Okay.
because there. And I only remember like two out of the three, but like one is legal risk that
Yep.
the vendor could be using open source software and not disclosing it, and so there could be legal ramifications. The other is they could be held accountable for vulnerabilities in their software, in their product, in
Yep.
some way, shape, form, or fashion, right?
And the
And
third one is
and
the
I think
secret
the other is
sauce.
like secret sauce, intellectual property, right?
Yeah.
Is the third one, that I don't want to say what's inside my product because that's intellectual property. Even if some of the modules and components are open source, I've got some that are commercial, and how I put them together is is the secret sauce.
Right. And which ones I use, which versions I use specifically.
Hmm.
The fact that all I'm doing is using glue code to put these things together, and clever
Mm.
field names and things like that. There's a lot of products out there that are nothing more than I thought of a different workflow to use these 5 common open source tools. I,
Yeah.
I, I close sourced them all, and now they're mine, and now I'm making money on it, which I don't have any problem with. But if you think of a clever way to do it, you should make money at it. That's fine. But yeah, if you disclose that, it could be ugly for you. So what we're seeing is SBOMs that say my piece of software is comprised of these 3 libraries. Like, I've never seen those library names before. And if you dig deeper, it's actually like 5 open source libraries in each one that they bring up a level, compile together or build together, and then build all 3 of those into the actual closed source product. But they don't extract or go down far enough to show you the actual open source libraries they're all based on.
Mhm.
And sometimes closed source libraries, because again, they don't want to expose it to you. So this is faking an SBOM basically. And this is why serialization and canonicalization is a real topic in SBOM world, to discuss how do we deal with this kind of thing. Not just people being confused or not doing it properly, but people maliciously screwing with the system.
Right. And I mean that's going to happen, and we need to be resilient against that. But also, I think vendors should know we're gonna create the SBOM anyway, and we've already seen this in industrial control systems. It was a whole project, I believe, that was presented at S4, where some vendors wouldn't provide an SBOM, some would, and so they're like, well, we're just going to generate it on our own, and they did it, which is awesome. So I think that information is going to be out there, and it's something we need to evangelize.
Matter of fact, there was a company, I think Chris Blask worked for them, that was getting the SBOM, decompiling the binary, and deciding, wait, they're lying.
Hmm.
So there
Yeah,
was a
there needs to
commercial
be checks and
company.
yeah, there
Yeah,
needs to be checks
Nice.
and balances as well.
yeah. It was interesting. Let's put it that way. I don't know if they still do that, but it was interesting. Let's put it that way. They found a lot of inconsistencies in SBOMs.
Hmm. Who's watching the watchers?
Oh, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. That is a saying for the ages, my friend. And
Hmm.
it goes for security as well. It goes, not just development, not just software. It goes for security. You bring a pen tester in. How do you know they don't hold back the actual vulnerability and come back in the middle of the night and steal your stuff? Okay. So this is a ever present problem.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Josh, I want to thank you for coming on Below the Surface. It was an amazing discussion, as always. Allan, thank you so much for
Yes, sir.
participating again. Yet again, it's great. We've got a great series of podcasts. Josh, thank you again, and thanks everyone for listening and watching to this edition of Below the Surface. We'll see you next time.